In a small town in Tennessee, 1975, the school auditorium buzzed with the usual chatter. Parents, kids, and locals gathered for the annual talent show. It was a simple event, just another night of community performances that would soon fade into the backdrop of everyday life. But no one in that room could have predicted what was about to unfold. A shy 12-year-old boy stepped onto the stage, trembling, clutching a microphone, his oversized jacket swallowing his small frame. The room fell quiet as he adjusted his stance, his nervous eyes scanning the crowd. He could barely hear the whispers. "He's too young for this. He won't pull it off." But the doubt was there, in the air. The boy took a breath and, with shaky hands, selected a song that seemed impossible for someone like him. He began to sing, and at first it wasn't much more than a fragile whisper. His voice cracked under the weight of the crowd's skeptical gaze. But then something changed. As he fought through the laughter and the whispers, something unexpected happened. At the back of the room, the door creaked open. A figure stepped in, and for a brief moment, the room held its breath. He was tall, cloaked in shadow, but unmistakable. Elvis Presley himself. The king had come to witness the unlikely performance of a boy whose voice had been drowned out by doubt. This was no ordinary talent show. This was the night everything changed, for both the boy and the man who would alter his life forever. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The old school auditorium in the small town of Nashville, Tennessee, was packed to the brim with parents, children, and curious locals. It was the fall of 1975, and the annual talent show was taking place. A simple event that was meant to showcase the young talent of the community. But no one knew, not yet, that this evening would be the beginning of a legend. In the dimly lit hall, the air was thick with excitement and expectation. People whispered to each other in the rows, their voices tinged with the buzz of anticipation. The soft rustle of programs and the occasional cough filled the air, the sounds of a typical school event. There were the usual acts, a juggling routine, a couple of kids playing piano, some younger children performing a clumsy dance routine. It all felt ordinary, pleasant even, but unremarkable. Then came the announcement. Next up, young Timmy White. Timmy, a 12-year-old boy, was small for his age, with a pale face that contrasted sharply against his messy brown hair. He was nervously adjusting the oversized jacket that belonged to his father, the sleeves rolled up far past his elbows, his fingers clutching the edges of the worn fabric. He stepped onto the stage with hesitance, the wooden floor creaking under his weight. The spotlight hit him instantly, making him squint in the harsh yellow glow. His heart pounded in his chest like a drumbeat, and his breath caught in his throat. He had always dreamed of this moment, the stage, the lights, the crowd. But in reality, it felt terrifying. He approached the microphone and stood in front of it, a small piece of paper with the lyrics to the song crumpled tightly in his hand. The music teacher had handed it to him before the show, warning him to practice, telling him that this was important. He knew he had rehearsed enough, but the pressure of the night was almost unbearable. He opened his mouth, the first note hesitant, almost faltering. The song he had chosen was "Can't Help Falling in Love" by Elvis Presley, a song his mother had always played on the record player, and one he felt a strange connection to. But as soon as he began to sing, a murmur swept through the audience. His voice, young and shaky, seemed to tremble in the vast auditorium, struggling to carry the weight of the words. The first note was cracked, the second one almost non-existent. A few people at the back of the hall exchanged glances, eyebrows raised, while others whispered under their breath, "He can't pull off Elvis." "This is a mistake," Someone muttered. "Poor kid, he doesn't stand a chance." A small laugh escaped from a group of teenage girls in the front row. It was a soft chuckle at first, then another followed, more audibly this time. Timmy's stomach twisted into knots as he heard them. His voice quivered as he tried to push through, his eyes glued to the lyrics on the crumpled sheet in his hand. But the laughter grew louder, seeping through the rows. It was the kind of laughter that seemed to amplify his fear, creating a thick, suffocating tension in the air. His hands, which held the sheet tightly, were trembling, his palms growing slick with sweat. He tried to sing the next line, but his voice faltered, and for a split second, he stopped. A few gasps filled the room, and the whispers turned into chuckles. Some began to shake their heads. In that instant, Timmy's eyes darted around the room, desperate for any kind of reassurance. But all he saw were faces, judging faces. His throat tightened, and for a moment, it felt as though the world was closing in on him. He had to stop. It would be easier to just give up now, walk off the stage, and disappear into the crowd. But then something in him shifted. A voice, a small voice in the back of his mind, told him to keep going. It wasn't loud enough to drown out the voices in the room, but it was strong enough to make him take a deep breath and step forward again. With a shaky exhale, he clutched the microphone tightly, feeling the cold metal against his fingers. He looked down at the sheet of paper in his hands and forced himself to focus. He wasn't going to quit. He was going to finish this, no matter how badly it hurt. He took another breath. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as he started again. His voice was thin, fragile, but it carried the lyrics of the song. The words came out haltingly, cracking like glass, but he pushed through. The tension in the room felt unbearable, but he refused to stop. Despite the sneers, despite the laughter that still echoed in the background, he kept singing. He barely noticed the teacher, Ms. Carter, standing at the side of the stage, trying to signal to the audience to be quiet, but her efforts only made the situation more awkward. Her nervous attempts to control the crowd fell flat, and the mocking laughter grew louder. But Timmy didn't hear any of that anymore. He had shut it out. His mind was focused only on the task at hand, the song, the words, the notes that escaped from his lips, each one a battle he fought with his own fear. The old stage lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the wooden floor. The smell of freshly waxed linoleum floor mingled with the faint scent of stale popcorn, creating an odd sense of familiarity. Yet in this moment, it felt like he was the only person in the room. The laughter, the whispers, everything else faded away, and all he had left was the song. And then, as if on cue, the first note of the song suddenly grew louder, a second of clarity in the chaos. His shaky voice, wobbly at first, slowly started to gain some confidence. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The cracking stopped. The tremor in his voice softened. For just a moment, the light shifted. It wasn't dramatic, just a slight movement, but it was enough for Timmy to feel it. He wasn't alone up there anymore. Something had changed. But the question remained. Would it be enough to turn the tide? Could this moment, so fragile and full of uncertainty, become something greater than a mere disaster? Would the audience see past the nerves and embrace the rawness of his effort? As Timmy reached for the next line, he closed his eyes for a second, letting himself forget about the laughter, the whispers. He focused only on the music, the words, and what it would mean to finish this, to prove to himself that he could. Timmy's voice wavered as he struggled to reach the higher notes of the song. The sound hung in the air, fragile and unsure, as if caught between hope and failure. The murmurs from the audience, once mocking, now felt like distant echoes. He was still battling the weight of their laughter, but he couldn't let it defeat him. Not yet. He couldn't let himself walk off the stage in disgrace. He wasn't sure why he was still going. Maybe it was the song. Maybe it was his mother's face in his mind. Or maybe it was something deeper, something that had been buried inside of him for years, finally emerging. But then, as if on cue, something changed in the room. It was subtle at first, a strange shift in the air that Timmy couldn't quite place. The whispers in the audience suddenly quieted, and for a fleeting moment, it was as if time had slowed. The tension that had gripped the room now felt different, heavier somehow. It wasn't the oppressive silence of a failure, but the kind of silence that comes before something extraordinary happens. The door at the far end of the auditorium creaked open. Timmy didn't notice at first. His focus was entirely on the microphone, his mind consumed by the struggle to finish the song, to make it through. But then, from the corner of his eye, he caught a shadow in the doorway. At first, it was nothing more than a silhouette, a figure standing motionless against the dim light. Timmy blinked, his throat tightening again, but he quickly returned his attention to the lyrics. However, something in the air was different. A ripple of confusion swept across the audience. The whispers returned, but this time they were less judgmental and more curious. "What was that?" someone murmured. A few heads turned toward the entrance, straining to catch a glimpse of whoever had entered. For the briefest moment, the audience was distracted. Their gazes shifted, but Timmy didn't have the luxury of looking away. His voice cracked again as he fought for control, but the noise from the back of the room was unmistakable. The whispers grew louder, a growing tide of speculation filling the space. "Is that? No, it couldn't be." Timmy's hands were still shaking, his body rigid with anxiety. But then a voice cut through the confusion. It wasn't a loud voice, more of a low murmur, but it was clear enough to reach Timmy's ears. "Is that Elvis?" A wave of shock rippled through the audience. The figure in the doorway stepped into the dim light, and for a moment, it was like time stopped. It was him, the king of rock and roll himself, Elvis Presley. He stood in the doorway, clad in a dark leather jacket, his trademark sunglasses reflecting the dim stage lights. His hair, dark and perfectly styled, framed his face. He was every bit the icon, but there was something else about him, something different. The way he moved, the grace in his steps, the way he commanded the space around him, seemed to draw the attention of everyone in the room. But despite his obvious presence, he didn't make a scene. He didn't rush to the stage. He simply stood there, quietly observing. A few people began to stand in shock, hoping for a better look. But Elvis held up a hand, a single graceful gesture that silenced the room. The audience, hesitant at first, complied, sitting back down, their excitement contained for now. The air was electric with anticipation. Timmy didn't notice. His eyes were still fixed on the crumpled paper, his hands gripping the microphone as if his life depended on it. His voice wavered again, higher now, cracking as he struggled to hit the next note. But the strange shift in the atmosphere seemed to have a calming effect on him. It wasn't that he could see Elvis. He couldn't, not yet. But there was something about the change in the room that made him feel less alone. The laughter had stopped. The cruel whispers had quieted. He glanced up instinctively, as if to sense the pulse of the room, but his gaze froze when he saw the figure standing near the back of the auditorium. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized him, the man who had captured the imagination of generations, the man whose music had filled the airwaves for years. Elvis Presley. For a moment, Timmy's breath caught in his throat. He stopped singing, his voice faltering as he stared in disbelief. The room seemed to hold its breath, and the silence became deafening. The few scattered whispers that had dared to speak were drowned out by the sheer magnitude of the moment. Timmy had no idea what to do. His heart pounded in his chest, and the microphone in his hand felt like a foreign object. His mind was spinning. But then, something incredible happened. Without a word, Elvis began to walk forward, moving through the rows of seats, slowly and deliberately, his gaze fixed on the stage. As he neared the front, the crowd parted before him like a wave parting in the sea, allowing the legend to pass through undisturbed. Timmy could hear the sound of footsteps in the otherwise silent auditorium, the rhythm of the walk slow and measured. Elvis stopped just in front of the stage, and for a moment he said nothing. He simply stared up at Timmy with a look that was difficult to interpret. Something between sympathy and curiosity. The king stood there, almost like a statue, just watching. And Timmy could hardly breathe. The seconds stretched on, and then, without warning, Elvis stepped forward again. This time, he wasn't standing in the back, waiting for the performance to end. No, this time, he was walking toward the stage, a slow, deliberate pace that echoed through the stillness of the hall. Timmy's eyes widened as Elvis approached the stage, stopping just short of stepping onto it. The crowd remained motionless, their anticipation palpable. Elvis, however, gave no indication of what he was thinking. His sunglasses hid his eyes, but his posture spoke volumes. He was sizing Timmy up, no doubt. Assessing. And then, in a gesture that shocked everyone, he raised his hand, signaling for the musicians to stop. The band, which had been playing quietly in the background, immediately went silent. The sharp contrast between the thick silence and the sudden halt of the music hung in the air like a taut wire. Elvis turned to the audience, his face a mask of calm, but his voice was steady and commanding as he spoke. "Let's give him a moment," he said quietly. The words, simple as they were, caused a ripple of shock through the audience. The crowd had been so certain that Elvis had come to witness the end of the show, to leave before things got worse. But now, it seemed as though he was willing to watch, to allow this young boy, this unassuming singer, to finish what he had started. And, for the first time since Timmy had begun, the room began to breathe again. Timmy's voice was faltering, still tentative, like a bird caught in a storm, unsure whether to take flight or crash. His eyes were locked onto the crumpled sheet in his hands, the paper now more a crutch than anything else. His body was trembling, but not from the cold. No, it was the weight of fear and self-doubt that had taken hold of him. The room was so still, so silent, that he could hear the beating of his own heart in his ears. For a moment, it felt like the world outside this auditorium had ceased to exist. The only thing that mattered, the only thing that Timmy could focus on, was the task in front of him, singing through the pain and finishing the song. And then, as if the universe itself had decided to intervene, a voice rang out from the back of the auditorium. It wasn't a whisper this time. No, it was a loud, unmistakable shout that shattered the fragile silence. "Hey, you call that singing?" the voice barked from the back, dripping with ridicule. The audience tensed. Timmy froze, his breath catching in his throat, as the laughter that had been held at bay for so long finally spilled out into the open. It wasn't the soft chuckling he had endured earlier. This was something worse. Mocking, cruel, a sneer that tore through the already thin veil of his confidence. For a split second, Timmy wanted to run. His feet felt as though they were anchored to the stage, too heavy to move. But it wasn't just the weight of fear that kept him in place. It was the overwhelming sense of helplessness that crashed over him like a wave. He had nowhere to hide. There was no escaping the gaze of the audience. The humiliation was already starting to consume him. The crowd's laughter seemed to grow louder, and the air grew thick with judgment. He had made the wrong choice, the wrong decision. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't good enough to sing an Elvis song. He should have picked something easier, something that wouldn't expose how far he fell short. The mockery was like acid, eating away at him, burning away whatever shred of hope he had left. But then, something unexpected happened. It wasn't the voice of the teacher, Ms. Carter, who had stood by him from the beginning, nor the kindly faces of his family, who were always his cheerleaders. No, it wasn't anyone he'd expected to speak. Instead, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed in the silence, slow and deliberate. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, and Timmy's eyes lifted from the floor, his throat tight with disbelief. It was him, Elvis Presley, the king himself. Timmy's heart skipped a beat, and for the briefest moment, he wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him. Was this real? Was he imagining this moment? His breath caught in his chest as he tried to process what was happening. Elvis was standing there, in the middle of the auditorium, staring at him. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet understanding, a recognition of something deeper than the music itself. The laughter began to fade into silence. The crowd, who had once been ready to tear Timmy down, now stood in stunned awe. People who had been mocking him only seconds ago were now staring in shock, unsure of what to make of this moment. Elvis stood there for a few beats, his presence commanding the room. It wasn't a loud declaration, but it was enough to stop everything. Timmy, still trembling, found himself unable to tear his gaze away. Elvis raised his hand, signaling for everyone to be still, to hold their breath. And the room, like a spell had been cast, obeyed. With his sunglasses still firmly in place, Elvis took a few steps forward, closer to the stage, his boots making soft thuds on the wooden floor. The murmurs and whispers that had filled the room now faded into a respectful hush. As he moved, Elvis's steps were measured, almost as if he were walking through a dream. His presence was magnetic, powerful yet humble, effortless yet commanding. Timmy stood frozen, eyes wide, his heart beating so loudly in his chest he wondered if anyone else could hear it. Was this really happening? Was this the same Elvis Presley who had once sung Jailhouse Rock, who had enchanted the world with his voice, his style, and his presence? Was he really standing here in front of him, watching him and waiting to see if he would finish his song? And then, with an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere, Elvis did something that left the room completely silent. He climbed onto the stage. The audience, which had been unsure whether to react to the sudden appearance of the king, now erupted into a quiet frenzy. The shock and awe that had spread through the room only moments before intensified, as Elvis, with an effortless grace, walked to the side of the stage. He didn't stand behind Timmy. He didn't need to. He simply positioned himself slightly off to the side, but close enough to Timmy that he could feel the magnetic pull of his presence. The first time Timmy had seen Elvis perform, it had been through grainy TV footage, black and white clips of the man who had redefined music. But this was different. This wasn't a recording. This wasn't some distant figure on a screen. This was real. This was in front of him, breathing the same air, standing on the same stage. And somehow, Elvis had not only walked into the room, but he was also standing there, looking at Timmy as if waiting for him to continue. For a long moment, the audience remained silent, almost as if they were waiting for the magic to unfold. The only sound in the room was the soft rustling of paper, as Timmy held on to the crumpled lyrics for dear life. His throat felt tight, but something inside him began to shift. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was the weight of possibility, the sheer force of the moment. Elvis didn't speak immediately. He simply raised an eyebrow and gave Timmy a slight nod, as if to say, "Go ahead, kid. You've got this." And then Elvis did something that took everyone by surprise. He reached down and, with a flick of his wrist, grabbed the second microphone that had been placed on the stage for the next performer. He raised it to his lips, and in the quiet of the auditorium, his voice rang out, low, smooth, and rich with that unmistakable Elvis charm. "Let's see what you've got, kid," he said, his words calm and steady, but carrying the weight of his presence. Timmy's heart stopped. The room held its breath. Elvis was waiting for him, not to give up, not to turn away, but to keep going, to finish the song. The boy, still unsure whether this was some kind of dream, closed his eyes. He took a deep breath and let the music fill him, let it carry him forward. With a new determination, he stepped up to the mic, hands trembling, but steadying as the first notes of "Can't Help Falling in Love" escaped his lips once again. But this time, it was different. This time, the music didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a lifeline. The king was with him. The tension in the air was palpable, and as Timmy's voice trembled, there was a moment, a fragile, suspended moment, when it seemed that the entire auditorium was holding its breath. But just as quickly as that silence came, it began to fade. The first note that Timmy reached for was not as uncertain as it had been before. It was still raw, but it had a certain clarity to it. The audience, which had once laughed, now listened in a stunned quiet, waiting. Elvis, standing just to the side, gave Timmy an almost imperceptible nod, a sign that he was not alone. His presence was both grounding and inspiring, a reminder that he was not just performing for an audience of critics, but for himself, for his dream, and for the very spirit of the song. Timmy's heart raced, but the fear had shifted. It was no longer the overwhelming weight of uncertainty, but the burning energy of excitement. He was beginning to feel the music more than he had ever thought possible. He could feel the words flowing through him, as though the song itself were alive, guiding him through the rough patches, lifting him when his voice wavered. With each note, Timmy's voice grew more confident, more controlled. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was real, raw, honest. And with that, something in the room shifted again. The laughter that had once hovered in the air was gone, replaced by something else. It was the quiet hum of anticipation, the feeling that something monumental was happening. Elvis stood beside him, microphone in hand, a quiet smile playing at the corners of his lips. He was waiting, patient, watching. But Timmy couldn't keep his eyes off of him. Every now and then, he would glance over at the legend who had suddenly become his partner, his mentor, his guide. And each time their gazes met, there was an unspoken understanding. Elvis wasn't just here to watch, he was here to help, to elevate. The band, which had been playing in the background, picked up the pace, sensing that something was about to happen. The slow rhythm of the song began to pick up, just slightly, giving the entire performance an undercurrent of energy. The notes swelled around Timmy, enveloping him, and for the first time in the entire performance, he stopped thinking about the audience. He stopped thinking about the mistakes, the fear, the laughter. All he focused on was the music. And then, as if by some unspoken cue, Elvis stepped forward. The king had been standing to the side, watching Timmy sing, but now he moved closer. He gestured to the band, a brief wave of his hand, and in that simple motion, the music swelled. Timmy, still trying to find his footing, felt the shift in the atmosphere. His breathing slowed, his heart calmed. Elvis leaned toward him, his voice low but clear as he spoke. "Don't look at them, kid. Look at me. You've got this." And just like that, it clicked. Timmy, his nerves still tingling with adrenaline, did exactly what Elvis said. He stopped glancing at the audience. Instead, he focused entirely on Elvis, on the man who had not just given him the greatest gift, but who was standing there, offering him the space to shine. He allowed the room to fade away. The stage, the audience, the pressure. It all disappeared. All that was left was the music. And with that, Timmy's voice, still unrefined but growing in strength, began to take shape. Elvis, knowing exactly how to work the room, adjusted his stance slightly, making way for the boy to feel the full weight of the spotlight. He took a step back, just far enough to give Timmy the space he needed, but close enough to offer silent support. The audience, who had once been skeptical, began to react. The room wasn't silent anymore. It was alive with energy. Timmy, now in his own rhythm, sang with a new fire. His voice wavered at times, but there was something so powerful about the way he sang it. He wasn't just performing a song anymore. He was living it, breathing it, and above all, he was feeling it. And that was when it happened. Elvis began to sing. The sound that came from his lips was nothing short of magical. It was smooth, rich, and full of the raw emotion that had made him an icon. As his voice filled the room, it wrapped around Timmy's, a perfect, seamless blend of two voices that shouldn't have worked together, but somehow did. Timmy's throat tightened, but it wasn't with fear. It was awe. He had dreamed of this moment since he was old enough to understand who Elvis Presley was. He had never thought he'd be standing next to him, let alone singing with him, but now, as the music enveloped them both, it was clear that Elvis wasn't just the king of rock and roll. He was a mentor, a friend, and a guiding light in a moment that could have been Timmy's greatest failure. Instead, it was becoming something unforgettable. The two voices blended in harmony, the deep, resonant tones of Elvis balancing with Timmy's higher, more fragile notes. The lyrics flowed like a river between them, and for a moment, it felt as if the whole auditorium was holding its breath, waiting for the next note to break the stillness. Timmy, though still nervous, had started to find his confidence. His voice had more weight behind it now, more control. Every time he hit a note that was just out of his reach, Elvis's presence seemed to pull him up, lifting him higher than he ever thought possible. With every step they took together in the song, Timmy felt a bond growing between them. It wasn't just about performing anymore. It was about sharing something real. The audience, once so skeptical, was now rapt. Their eyes were wide with wonder, unable to look away. And then, as the song built to its crescendo, Timmy did something unexpected. He reached for a higher note, one that had been just beyond his grasp earlier in the song. But now, with the weight of Elvis beside him, with the power of the moment coursing through him, he hit it. And it was perfect. The room erupted into applause, and for the briefest moment, Timmy felt like he was floating. The sound of the crowds clapping, the cheers, the rising volume. It felt like a wave crashing over him, lifting him up higher and higher. But amidst the applause, one sound stood out. Elvis's voice, warm and low, speaking over the noise. "That's it, kid," Elvis said, his smile wide, genuine. "You've got the heart of a star." The moment they finished the song, the room was not just applauding the performance. They were applauding the moment. The connection between Timmy and Elvis was undeniable, a bond forged in the fire of a shared passion for music. Timmy, who had once been trembling with fear, was now standing tall, his eyes shining with pride. He had done it, but as the applause continued, Timmy's eyes never left Elvis. The king's smile was warm, and there was a sense of pride in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of what they had just shared. It wasn't just a performance, it was a moment that would live forever. And for Timmy, it wasn't just the end of a song, it was the beginning of everything. The applause rang out like a thunderclap, crashing through the walls of the auditorium, shaking the very air with its intensity. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, and, for a moment, Timmy stood frozen in place, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. His heart was still racing from the performance, still beating out the rhythm of the song they had just finished. And yet, there was an undeniable sense of disbelief in his chest. The boy who had entered this contest so unsure of himself, whose voice had cracked, whose hands had trembled, was now standing center stage, receiving the kind of recognition few could ever hope for. And not just from anyone, but from the king himself. Elvis Presley, the very man Timmy had idolized for years, stood beside him, a proud and knowing look on his face. The applause was still echoing in Timmy's ears, and for a moment he thought he might collapse from the sheer weight of the moment. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to respond. But Elvis, always the showman, always the one to know just what the moment required, turned to face the crowd and held up his hand, signaling for the applause to quiet down. As the room slowly settled, Timmy could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him. The eyes of the townspeople, the teachers, his friends, his family, everyone. And among them, the gaze of Elvis, who still stood beside him, as if offering his silent support. The silence stretched for a moment before Elvis broke it, his voice cutting through the stillness with the same calm, deep drawl that had made him a legend. "This here ain't just any talent show, folks," Elvis began, his words deliberate, his eyes moving over the audience. He paused, letting the words sink in, and then turned his gaze back to Timmy, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "No, this right here is about something bigger. It's about the power of a dream. And this young man, well, he's just proved something to all of us." Timmy swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had no idea what to say, how to process the weight of Elvis's words. He was standing there, in front of everyone, and somehow, in some incredible, impossible way, this legendary figure was speaking directly to him. But Elvis wasn't finished. The king took a step forward, his hand resting gently on Timmy's shoulder, as if making sure that the weight of his next words would land firmly, gently, yet powerfully on the young boy's heart. "I'm telling you all, I've seen a lot of performances in my time," Elvis continued, his voice warm with sincerity. "But this right here, this kid, he's got something special. He's got heart. And that's what matters more than anything." A soft gasp of surprise moved through the audience, and Timmy could hear the quick intake of breath from his mother, seated in the back row. His heart skipped a beat as he tried to take in what was happening. His mother, who had always been there for him, who had been his biggest supporter, was now witnessing the moment of a lifetime. She was watching her son stand next to his idol, receiving not just praise, but recognition from him. Elvis looked down at Timmy, his smile widening. "I think we've got a special guest here tonight, don't you think?" he asked the crowd, raising an eyebrow. The audience, now fully in the palm of Elvis's hand, erupted into applause again. Timmy, his face flushed with a mixture of awe and disbelief, simply nodded, still too stunned to speak. His voice had been stolen by the weight of everything that had just transpired. The world felt as if it had tilted on its axis, shifting into a new reality. A reality where he had just sung with Elvis Presley. A reality where his dream, the one he had carried quietly in his heart for so long, was now no longer a far-off fantasy, but something tangible, something within reach. And then, just as Timmy was beginning to process the enormity of the moment, Elvis did something that would forever alter the course of his life. From the folds of his jacket, Elvis produced a shimmering white scarf, something that Timmy had seen the legend wear during many of his performances. It was the kind of scarf that only someone of Elvis's stature could wear, an iconic piece of his stage persona. The audience fell silent again, watching with wide eyes, unsure of what was coming next. Timmy, still standing frozen in the light, couldn't help but stare at the scarf. He knew what it was. He knew the significance of it. Elvis had given away his scarves before, but never to someone like him. Someone from a small town. Someone so far removed from the glittering world of stardom. But Elvis wasn't done. With a swift, fluid motion, Elvis stepped toward Timmy, reaching out to place the scarf gently around the young boy's neck. The gesture was so simple, so unassuming, yet it held a weight that Timmy could feel in his very bones. The crowd seemed to hold its breath, watching this exchange like it was some kind of sacred moment. "This here," Elvis said softly, his voice carrying only for Timmy's ears, "isn't just a scarf. It's a symbol, kid. A symbol that dreams are worth chasing. And you've just proven that you've got what it takes. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Timmy's eyes welled with tears, but he blinked them away, unwilling to let the moment slip by without fully absorbing it. The sensation of the scarf against his skin, the weight of it around his neck, was nothing short of surreal. He could hardly believe it was happening, but he could feel its truth, its significance deep in his chest. The audience watched, awestruck, as Elvis finished the moment with a smile and a nod, looking back toward the rest of the crowd. "I'll tell you this, folks," he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "You'll be seeing this kid again. And when you do, remember tonight. Remember how he stood up here and gave us all a glimpse of something extraordinary." Timmy couldn't find his voice, but it didn't matter. His heart was full, overflowing even, and all he could do was stand there, in the center of that stage, and try to process the impossible thing that had just happened. The gift of the scarf, the words of encouragement, the recognition from Elvis Presley himself. He had been part of something that no one would ever forget. But there was more. There was a promise. "You're not just going to leave this stage and fade away into the crowd, Timmy," Elvis continued, his tone serious now, his eyes locked onto the boys. "You're going to perform with me next week, at a charity concert. We'll make sure everyone knows your name, kid. I'll give you the chance to show the world what you've got." The audience erupted into applause once more, but this time it wasn't just for Timmy. It was for the moment itself, the kind of moment that only happens once in a lifetime, the kind of moment that changes everything. For Timmy, it was no longer just about the talent show. It was no longer just about a boy trying to prove himself. This was the beginning of a new life, a life where dreams weren't just something to wish for. They were something to live. And with that, the evening had changed forever. As the final note of the song faded into the air, the audience sat in stunned silence. Their collective breath held for just a moment longer than expected. And then, like a dam breaking, the applause erupted. It wasn't a polite clapping, the kind one might give for a local talent show performance. No, this was something different. It was as if the entire auditorium had been holding back a flood of emotion, and now it came pouring out, loud and unrestrained. The walls shook with the power of the sound, the floor vibrating beneath Timmy's feet. He stood frozen for a moment, still trying to comprehend the overwhelming reality of what had just happened. Timmy's eyes darted between the faces in the crowd. His mother, sitting in the back, was clutching her hands together, her face a mixture of disbelief and pure joy. Her eyes were wet with tears, and her smile was so wide it seemed to stretch beyond the confines of her face. She had always known that her son had something special, but seeing him up there, standing beside Elvis Presley himself, this was something beyond her wildest dreams. And for a moment, Timmy could hardly believe it himself. His thoughts were a whirlwind, tumbling over each other, struggling to find solid ground. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. This was the stuff of dreams, not reality. But before he could allow himself to drift into disbelief, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked up, meeting the gaze of Elvis, who was smiling down at him, a gentle, knowing smile that carried all the weight of the past few minutes. Timmy's heart leaped into his throat, and he swallowed hard, suddenly feeling like he had to catch his breath. Elvis leaned in close, his voice soft but steady, just for Timmy. "Don't let it go to your head, kid. This is just the beginning." He gave a small chuckle, his eyes twinkling. "But I think you know that already." Timmy could hardly respond, his voice caught somewhere between awe and gratitude. He simply nodded, unable to form coherent words. Elvis was right. This was just the beginning. But it felt like everything had changed in the space of a few minutes. And Timmy knew that his life, the life he had always dreamed of, had been irrevocably altered. But there was more, so much more that was still ahead. As the applause slowly began to die down, people started to shuffle out of their seats. There were hurried conversations, people talking excitedly to each other, their voices rising in excitement as they turned to friends and family. The shock of witnessing such a rare moment, the king of rock and roll standing on the stage, singing with a local kid, was still fresh in everyone's minds, and they couldn't stop talking about it. But the room was not quite as loud as it seemed. There was a hum, a subtle shift in the energy of the space, as if the evening had taken on a deeper significance. The crowd had witnessed something that would be etched into their memories forever, something that they would talk about for years. They knew, deep down, that they had seen a moment of history, even if they couldn't fully grasp it in the chaos of the moment. Timmy, still standing in the center of the stage, felt the gravity of it all slowly sinking in. It was a mixture of exhilaration and disbelief. He had dreamed of being noticed, of being recognized for his talents. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. The real world, the world he had known all his life, seemed to be shifting before his very eyes. He had just sung with Elvis Presley. Not only that, but Elvis had recognized him, had given him a chance, a gift that no one could have predicted. In the midst of the still thrumming excitement, Elvis turned to the crowd once more, raising his hand in a gesture of quiet authority. He smiled, a genuine smile that seemed to encompass the entire room. "I'm telling you all," he said, his voice carrying through the hall. "This kid has got something that can't be taught. It's heart, and that's the most important thing in this business." There was a brief pause as the crowd absorbed his words, and then, as if on cue, the applause started again, louder this time, as if the audience now understood what they had just witnessed. But Timmy was lost in the moment, feeling the weight of Elvis's praise wash over him like a warm tide. It was more than he had ever hoped for. It was everything. And yet, There was still that quiet voice inside him, urging him not to let the moment slip by, urging him to hold on to the feeling, to remember that this was only the beginning. After the show, the crowd slowly started to disperse, but there was no immediate rush to leave. No one seemed eager to move away from what had just unfolded. Conversations swirled around Timmy, with people congratulating him, asking him questions, telling him how proud they were to have witnessed such a moment. Timmy felt a strange sense of detachment from it all, as if he were standing on the outside, watching everything unfold. He was grateful, overwhelmed, but also unsure of how to process the fact that his life had just shifted so dramatically in the span of a few hours. But amidst the chaos, there was one thing that stood out, that felt like the center of everything. Elvis, who had made his way through the crowd, was now standing off to the side, speaking with Timmy's mother. The two of them were talking quietly, their voices low, but there was a sense of familiarity between them, as if they had known each other for far longer than a few minutes. Timmy's mother was crying now, tears streaming down her face, but these were not the tears of shock or disbelief. These were tears of joy. She had been through so much with Timmy, fighting for him, supporting him, always telling him that he had the potential to be something great. But now, here she was, watching her son, her little boy, standing next to Elvis Presley, and not as some distant figure on a screen, but as a peer, as a partner in this surreal moment. Timmy slowly made his way to them, his feet heavy as he walked across the stage. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, but they didn't bother him anymore. What bothered him now was the deep sense of change that seemed to permeate everything, the knowledge that his life was no longer the same. As he reached his mother and Elvis, she turned to him, her eyes still wet but filled with pride. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. Timmy could feel her trembling slightly, but he couldn't tell if it was from the excitement or from the overwhelming emotion of the moment. "You did it, Timmy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You did it. I knew you had it in you." Timmy smiled, feeling a lump form in his throat. He didn't know what to say. There were no words that could capture what he was feeling in that moment. Elvis, who had been standing quietly off to the side, now stepped forward, his eyes soft with admiration. "You know, kid," he said, his voice low but filled with sincerity, "I think this is just the start of something big for you. And I'm not just talking about tonight. I'm talking about your future. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The words struck Timmy deep in his heart. It was the kind of validation that he had spent his entire life chasing. And now, here it was, delivered in a way that he could never have anticipated. "You're going places, kid," Elvis said, giving him a firm nod of encouragement. "And I'll be right here watching you every step of the way." With those words, Elvis turned and walked toward the door, his presence still radiating through the room. Timmy watched him leave, his thoughts whirling. Everything had changed. And as the door clicked shut behind Elvis, Timmy knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same again. The week that followed the talent show felt like a blur to Timmy. It was as if the world had tilted on its axis, and everything he had known was now viewed through a different lens. The town, once so familiar and quiet, now seemed to hum with anticipation. Everywhere he went, people stopped him. They congratulated him, told him how proud they were, how they had never imagined something like this happening in their small town. Timmy had never felt so seen, so important. His every move was followed by whispered excitement, and his life, once small and simple, had expanded in a way he couldn't have possibly prepared for. But the most incredible part was knowing that Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll himself, had promised to bring him to Memphis, to perform at a charity concert. A real concert, in front of real fans. Timmy could hardly believe it. How could something so extraordinary be happening to him? It felt like a dream, but every moment of it felt more real than anything he had ever experienced. The day of the concert arrived, and Timmy, along with his mother, stood at the airport in Nashville, waiting for their flight to Memphis. The weight of it all was almost too much to bear. His hands were trembling slightly, but he could feel his mother's steady presence beside him, her hand on his arm, grounding him in a way that only she could. She hadn't said much, but Timmy could sense her emotions: pride, excitement, awe. She was as nervous as he was, but in her eyes was the unmistakable love and support that had carried him through every step of his journey. As they walked toward the gate, Timmy couldn't help but glance around. Everything felt so surreal. The people in the airport, some of them recognizing him, some of them still unaware of who he was, seemed to blur together. His mind kept returning to the thought that he was about to meet Elvis again, about to sing on stage with him. It was a thought that seemed too big to fit inside his head, so much bigger than the small boy from Tennessee who had once been afraid to sing in front of his own classmates. The flight to Memphis was short, but Timmy hardly noticed the time pass. He barely ate anything, his stomach a swirling mass of excitement and nerves. The moment they landed, he was met by a small team of Elvis's staff. They were friendly but efficient, leading him and his mother through the airport and into a waiting car. Timmy tried to take in the surroundings, the lights, the bustle, the unfamiliar faces, but everything seemed to move in slow motion. It was like walking through a dream, one that he wasn't sure he was fully awake for. Memphis, with its long history and rich culture, felt like another world altogether. As they drove toward the venue, Timmy caught glimpses of the city: neon signs, the thrum of busy streets, and the distant hum of music that seemed to fill the air. This was a place of music, a place where legends were born. And now, Timmy was about to step into that world. The concert was held at a large, well-known theater in downtown Memphis, a venue that had seen some of the biggest names in the music industry. As the car pulled up to the entrance, Timmy's breath caught in his throat. The lights outside the theater were dazzling, the crowd gathering in anticipation, their excited chatter rising up like a wave. People had started to line the streets, eager to catch a glimpse of the stars. It was nothing like the small-town auditorium he had performed in a week ago. This was the big leagues. "Are you ready, kid?" one of Elvis's staff members asked, his voice calm but with a hint of excitement beneath the surface. Timmy could barely nod. His heart was pounding in his chest, but a small part of him, the part that had been growing stronger ever since the talent show, told him he was ready. He had to be. When they entered the theater, Timmy was almost overwhelmed by the size of the stage, the sea of empty seats, and the echo of anticipation hanging in the air. It was larger than anything he had ever seen. He felt small again, a little boy in a big, unfamiliar world. But then he remembered what Elvis had told him just days ago. "This is just the beginning." With those words in mind, Timmy steadied his breath and walked backstage. Elvis was already there, as charismatic and relaxed as ever. He was surrounded by a few people, his manager, a couple of musicians, but when he saw Timmy, he broke into a wide grin and walked over to him with that familiar swagger. "Well, well," Elvis said, his voice full of warmth. "Look who's here. You ready to rock this place?" Timmy could hardly speak, but he nodded, his voice momentarily lost. Elvis clapped him on the back, his touch reassuring. "Don't worry, kid. You've got this. Just follow my lead." For the next few hours, they rehearsed. The song they would sing together was the same one they had performed at the talent show, Can't Help Falling in Love. But this time, it felt different. This time, there were no nerves. This time, there were no doubts. Timmy felt the music move through him as though it was a part of him, something he could touch, something that was meant to be. As the rehearsal came to an end, Elvis gave him a wink and a smile. "You're a natural, Timmy. Just remember, look at me when we get up there. You've got nothing to prove. Just have fun." Timmy smiled, his nerves easing just a little. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about the music, about sharing something special. And with Elvis beside him, he felt like he could do anything. When the moment finally arrived and the lights dimmed, Timmy's heart skipped a beat. He stood backstage, looking out at the sea of faces waiting for the show to begin. The music of the crowd, the energy that filled the air, was electric. And then, without warning, the spotlight hit the stage, and Elvis walked out, his figure commanding the attention of everyone in the room. The audience erupted in cheers, and Timmy's breath caught in his throat. He followed close behind, his feet moving almost without him. As soon as he stepped onto the stage, the overwhelming feeling of being part of something so much larger than himself hit him. The stage was vast, the lights blinding, but the only thing that mattered was the music. Elvis turned to him, giving him one last reassuring look, and then he motioned for Timmy to step closer. The crowd quieted, the anticipation palpable. The music started, and Elvis's deep voice filled the room, smooth and powerful, carrying the opening notes of the song. Timmy, standing in the light beside his idol, took a breath and stepped forward. His voice, stronger now, more confident, rose to meet Elvis's, and for the first time, Timmy felt like he truly belonged. He wasn't just a small-town boy anymore. He was a part of this world, a part of the magic that had been created that night. As they sang together, the audience's reaction was immediate. Applause, cheers, shouts of excitement. The energy in the room was overwhelming, and Timmy, for the first time in his life, felt like a star. A real one. And as they finished the song, the crowd stood, applauding, their cheers rising to a deafening roar. Timmy felt his heart swell with emotion, his breath coming in short, happy bursts. This was it. This was everything he had ever dreamed of. And it was just the beginning. Elvis leaned toward him, his voice low enough that only Timmy could hear. "You did it, kid. You've got a real future ahead of you." Timmy could barely respond, his heart still racing with excitement. He had done it. He had stood on stage with the king of rock and roll, and he had given everything he had. And as he looked out at the cheering crowd, he knew that this was only the start of a new chapter in his life. A chapter that would be written with music, with passion, and with dreams that were no longer impossible. The next morning, the world Timmy had known was gone. The small town he'd grown up in, the one that had always felt so familiar and quiet, now felt like a distant memory. The echoes of the charity concert still reverberated in his ears, the sound of the crowd's cheers, the warmth of the stage lights, the sensation of Elvis's arm around his shoulders as they performed together. But as the sun rose over Nashville, Timmy realized that what had happened just a few days ago had been more than just a fleeting moment. It was the beginning of something new, something real. News of the charity concert spread like wildfire through the town. It wasn't long before the phone calls started, the messages, the visitors. It seemed that everyone who had ever known Timmy, or even just heard of him, had something to say. They were all caught up in the excitement, in the magic of it all, and Timmy could hardly wrap his head around it. By the time they returned home from Memphis, the local radio stations were buzzing with talk of his performance. Timmy was overwhelmed, his head spinning with the whirlwind of events that had unfolded since that night in the school auditorium. The morning after the concert, as Timmy sat at the breakfast table, his mother came into the room holding the morning paper. She was smiling so wide that her eyes were glistening with unshed tears, but it was the headline on the front page that stole the air from Timmy's lungs. It read, "Local boy sings with Elvis. A star is born." The photograph beneath it showed Timmy, standing on stage beside Elvis, the two of them singing together. Timmy's face was lit up with excitement, his eyes wide, a look of pure joy. He couldn't believe it. That picture, his picture, was being seen by the entire town. It felt impossible, like something out of a movie. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. His mother set the paper down in front of him, her hands shaking. "You did it, Timmy. You really did it. People are talking about you everywhere. You've become someone." Timmy nodded, his thoughts racing. He hadn't yet wrapped his head around the fact that his life had changed forever. His phone had been ringing non-stop, with calls from local news outlets, radio stations, and even some reporters from Memphis. They all wanted to talk to him, to hear his story, to know how it felt to sing with Elvis. But the thing that struck him the most was the way the people in town were reacting. They were proud of him, sure. But they were also in awe of what he had achieved, and he hadn't even fully understood it himself. His mother, still standing beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm so proud of you, Timmy. I knew you had it in you. I just knew." But the pride in her voice was mixed with something else. Something Timmy hadn't quite anticipated. A sense of disbelief. He had always been her son, the boy she had raised, the one who had struggled to find his place in the world. Now, it seemed, he had found it, and the world had found him. A knock at the door interrupted the moment, and Timmy's mother quickly went to answer it. When she opened the door, a man stood there, mid-40s, wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase. Timmy didn't recognize him, but the look on his mother's face changed immediately. It was a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Mrs. White?" the man asked, his voice polite but firm. "Yes, that's me," she replied. "Can I help you?" The man stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "I'm with a talent agency out of Nashville. My name is Greg Lawrence, and I've been following your son's performance for the past few days. I'd like to talk to you about something important." Timmy sat frozen at the table, trying to process the exchange. A talent agent? He had heard about talent agents before, people who discovered performers, helped them rise to stardom, but he hadn't thought for a second that he would ever be in this position. Not him. He was just a kid from a small town who liked to sing. What could they possibly want with him? His mother, sensing his confusion, motioned for him to come closer. She was trying to keep her composure, but Timmy could see that she was struggling. She was nervous, too. "I've been in the business for a long time," Greg Lawrence continued, sitting down across from them, his eyes intense but calculating. "And I can tell you right now that your son has something rare, something that can't be taught. I saw the performance in Memphis, and I've been in touch with a few people in the industry. They're all interested in him." Timmy's heart skipped a beat, and he glanced at his mother, who was holding her breath. "What does that mean?" Timmy asked, his voice tentative. He was trying to wrap his mind around it all. He had been performing for years, practicing in his room, singing for his family, but he had never once imagined that this kind of opportunity would come knocking on his door. Greg Lawrence smiled, sensing Timmy's hesitation. "It means, Timmy, that you have a future in this business. We want to represent you. We want to help you get the exposure you deserve. I've already made some calls. There's interest from record labels, and we're even talking about a spot on a major television show. All you need to do is say yes." The words hit Timmy like a tidal wave, and for a moment, he could hardly breathe. His mind was racing. Record labels? Television shows? This was everything he had ever wanted. But it also felt like a world that was too big for him, too far removed from the life he had known. He had dreamed of being a singer, of being on stage. But now that it was becoming real, he wasn't sure if he was ready. His mother turned to him, her face a mixture of pride and concern. "What do you think, Timmy? This is your dream. It's everything you've ever wanted." But was it? Timmy's thoughts were tangled. He had always wanted to perform, to share his voice with the world. But was he ready to take this next step? To enter the spotlight in a way that would leave no room for going back? His heart was torn between the excitement of the future and the fear of losing everything that had made him feel grounded. Greg watched him patiently, sensing the weight of Timmy's decision. "You don't have to decide right away, but we're offering you something big, something that could change your life forever." The weight of his words hung heavy in the room. Timmy knew this was the moment that would define the rest of his life. And as the world outside seemed to buzz with excitement, as the phone continued to ring, he realized that no matter what he decided, there was no going back to the life he had once known. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Timmy looked up at his mother and smiled. I think I'm ready." And with that simple decision, the course of his life was set. What had started as a moment of doubt, a shy boy trying to find his voice, had now transformed into the beginning of a journey that would take him places he had never imagined. Timmy knew that there would be challenges ahead, that the road would not always be easy. But he also knew that, with his mother by his side, and with the gift of music in his heart, he was ready to face whatever came next. As Greg Lawrence left their house, a new chapter began. The future was calling, and for the first time, Timmy wasn't afraid. He was ready to step into it. The months following Timmy's decision to pursue his dreams felt like a whirlwind. Each day seemed to bring new opportunities, new challenges, and new moments of doubt. But they were balanced by something even more powerful, the overwhelming sense that he was exactly where he needed to be. The boy who had once been too afraid to sing in front of his classmates was now standing on the brink of something extraordinary. He had gone from being a quiet kid with a dream to being the subject of local headlines, and now, it seemed, the world was starting to notice. It was the spring of 1976, just months after that life-altering night at the school talent show, and Timmy found himself on a massive stage in Memphis again. But this time, the scale was unfathomable. The venue was filled with thousands of people, the bright lights of the arena blinding him, the crowd buzzing with anticipation. The sound of their chatter filled the air like a low hum, but it was drowned out by the thumping of his heart in his chest. This was it, the moment he had dreamed about for years. This was what he had worked for, what he had fought for. Timmy had grown in so many ways in the short time since he'd first set foot on that stage with Elvis. He had undergone vocal coaching, spent hours learning to control his breathing, his voice, his stage presence. He was no longer the timid boy who had faltered in front of a crowd. He was someone different now, someone who was finally stepping into his own light. Elvis had kept his word. Just as promised, the king had brought him along for another concert, this time one with a broader audience, filled with industry professionals, media, and music fans from all over the country. And this time, it wasn't just a brief duet. This was Timmy's moment. He would be performing in front of 15,000 people, opening for the man who had once been his idol, but now had become a mentor. The music, the spotlight, the roar of the crowd. It was all so much more than he had ever imagined. As Timmy stood backstage, the familiar, comforting presence of his mother was by his side. She had always been his rock, and now, as she looked at him, her face filled with pride, he could sense that she, too, had changed. The journey had altered them both, bringing them closer together, making them stronger, more resilient. She had always believed in him, but now, seeing him up on this stage, poised and confident, it felt like the culmination of a long, uncertain road. "You're ready, Timmy," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "You've always been ready." The words settled deep in his chest, and he nodded, the nervousness in his stomach beginning to melt away. He had worked so hard to get here, and now he wasn't going to let fear take hold of him. He wasn't the shy, nervous boy anymore. He was a performer, a rising star, and this was his time. The lights on stage dimmed, and the crowd's energy shifted, growing palpable, vibrating with excitement. Timmy could hear the buzz of conversation die down, the low murmurs of anticipation turning into eager whispers. The curtain slowly began to rise, and Timmy stepped forward, the bright spotlight cutting through the darkness and landing squarely on him. He could feel the heat of the light on his face, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like an anchor, but he didn't flinch. He was ready. His heart was pounding, but his steps were steady. He walked to the center of the stage and looked out at the sea of faces in the audience. The faces of the fans, the media, the professionals. They were all here to see him, to hear his voice, to witness the raw talent that had been nurtured in the small town of Nashville and brought to life on these grand stages. The weight of their gaze could have been overwhelming, but somehow, in this moment, it was empowering. From the wings of the stage, he could see Elvis standing, waiting for him. The king, ever the showman, stood with a confident grin on his face, his arms crossed. There was no doubt in his eyes, only that same calm confidence that had brought Timmy so far. He gave Timmy a small nod, a silent gesture that said, "You've got this, kid." Timmy took a deep breath and stepped forward, microphone in hand. He had learned a lot in the time since he had first performed. He knew the music now, felt it in his bones, and he knew what he needed to do. The band began to play, the familiar notes of "Can't Help Falling in Love" floating up from the speakers. The crowd settled into a silence that was filled with expectation, waiting for the first sound, the first note, the first glimpse of what was about to unfold. And then Timmy sang. His voice, clear, rich, and full of power, echoed through the arena, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel afraid. There was no shaking hands, no trembling voice. He was in control. He was confident. He was a star. As his voice soared through the opening lines, he felt the weight of the moment begin to melt away. The nervousness was gone, replaced by something deeper. This was his purpose. This was what he was meant to do. The audience's reaction was instantaneous. A ripple of applause spread through the crowd, a wave of approval, of appreciation. Timmy could feel the energy from the people in the seats, their admiration, their excitement. The nerves he'd felt in the past, the self-doubt, were distant memories now. As he hit the chorus, his voice harmonized with Elvis's in a perfect blend. It was as if the two voices were meant to merge together. And then, as the song built to its climax, Elvis took a step back, allowing Timmy to finish the song on his own. For the first time in the performance, the spotlight was fully on Timmy. It was his moment to shine, to show the world exactly what he was capable of. The final note rang out, strong and pure, and as the music came to an end, the crowd erupted in applause, standing on their feet in a show of appreciation and adoration. Timmy's heart soared as the sound of their cheers filled the arena. He had done it. He had performed not just for his hometown, not just for the small town he had always known, but for the world. He had proven to himself and to everyone else that he belonged here. Elvis, who had been standing off to the side, his hands clasped behind his back, broke into a wide smile. He stepped forward, giving Timmy a warm, approving glance. There was no need for words. They both knew that this moment, this night, was a milestone. Timmy's journey, which had started in a small school auditorium, had now come full circle. He had gone from being the shy boy with a dream to standing on stage in front of thousands, singing alongside a legend. But even more than that, he had become a symbol of hope, of possibility, for anyone who had ever been told that their dreams were too big. His story wasn't just his own anymore. It was a story that could inspire others to take the leap, to chase their dreams no matter how impossible they seemed. As the lights dimmed and the roar of the audience washed over him, Timmy looked out over the sea of faces one last time. The applause was still deafening, but in the midst of it, he felt a quiet peace. This was only the beginning, and he knew that no matter where the road took him, he would always carry this moment with him. The stage lights slowly began to fade, but the memory of this night would never leave him. The music had found him, and in return, he had found his voice. And that voice, Timmy's voice, was destined to echo for years to come.